Morning, evening, whatever it is. We finished up Woodrow Wilson in the last video. Woodrow Wilson, who is high-minded and clearly very cold-blooded. You can kind of see in that portrait photo of him his personality. Here is a man who was an academic, who was a university professor and president of a university with 2 years political experience, who had no international experience, no experience with foreign affairs, and hoped he didn't have to deal with it, and instead had to deal with all kinds of foreign affairs, the main one being, of course, the First World War. And the First World War is one that's often neglected in American history, not in European history. It's a big one there. There are monuments all over the place. We have almost nothing. For one reason, it was not on our soil. It was, as the song says, over there. Number two, we were not in the war for 4 years. We were only in there for 2 years. So the question is, why is it neglected? And number two, why did we wait so long to get into it? It was called in Europe and America the Great War until we had World War II, and then it became World War I. America is almost going to be, by definition, involved with this because we are at this point one or two world's superpower. After World War I, we were clearly the world's superpower. Right before 1900, at the time of the Spanish-American War, we probably were 17th in the world, certainly in military power, and also rising in economic power, but more in military power. After World War I, we are number one military power in the world. And we are, as Teddy Roosevelt said, the world's policeman at this point, for better or for worse. I am working with the PowerPoint, World War I, obviously, and starting out with the first slide, talking about the causes of the war. More importantly is the second slide, which is the map of Europe and West Asia. What you have basically as a cause is the collapse of empires. You had the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which had existed since the early Middle Ages for hundreds of years. It was too sprawling, too many diverse populations, and at the point of collapse, you also have the Ottoman Empire in what is now the Mideast, which had also existed for about 500 years at this point and was also at the point of collapse. These are old empires that 500 years ago had been very strong, but are now old, decrepit, and disintegrating. So what you have essentially is a power vacuum. And in this power vacuum, you have the rise of ethnic groups, ethnic minorities. So a good example is the Austro-Hungarian Empire, because you had Czechs, you had Poles, you had Romanians, you had people in the Balkans. The Greeks were part of the Ottoman Empire, but you had the Serbs, you had the Croatians. You had at least 15 different ethnic groups, all of whom are looking for self-government. So basically, the empires could not hold together. The trigger, the immediate cause, is in June 1914. There is a Bosnian Serb who assassinates the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That wonderfully named, I think the band is still around, Franz Josef. So once he kills him, and he kills him in Sarajevo, and I was in Sarajevo about 2 summers ago and stood on the corner where Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. And that is a place where the chills run up your spine, because at that point, millions were slaughtered after that incident. And it was completely an accident. It's an interesting story. The guy was part of a plot to kill the Archduke, and the route of his procession and his carriage changed, and it happened to pass right in front of where this guy was, who thought he'd never have a chance at it. He pulled out his pistol, killed him, killed his wife. Immediate reaction is Austro-Hungary invades Serbia. Serbia is Eastern Orthodox. They are called the little brothers of Russia, which is also Eastern Orthodox, very close ties with Russia still today. And Russia comes in to help Serbia. The other cause you have, besides the collapse, the disintegration of these empires, is all these interlocking alliances. Everybody had signed alliances with everybody else. So the Serbs are allied with the Russians are allied with the British are allied with the French, the Austro-Hungarians are allied with the Turks are allied with, Italians, whatever. Anyway, you have all of these interlocking alliances. So once there is a problem in one corner, everybody is sucked in, essentially. So who do you have on one side? The Central Powers were Germany, Austro-Hungary, which of course speaks German except for the Hungarians. They're also German-speaking and closely tied to Germany, and the Ottoman Empire on one side. The Allied powers, England, France, Russia. Watch Russia, because she doesn't last throughout the whole war. Later on, of course, we joined the Allied side. The question is, why are we out for 2 years? If this is a world war, why did we stay out? And first of all, it is over 3,000 miles away. So many Americans, why would we get involved with this? This does not bother us. It turned out it does bother us. But in the beginning, they thought, we don't have to get involved with this. We don't have to spend blood and treasure on this war. Woodrow Wilson, progressive, other progressives are very anti-war. War is not a progressive measure, despite Teddy Roosevelt being a war lover. Most progressives were against war. We were trying to help mankind and not slaughter them. Woodrow Wilson's campaign slogan in 1916 was, "He kept us out of war." And he won by a fairly small majority of 600,000 votes. So you have a huge progressive party. This is the big movement in America, who is anti-war. You have pacifists who will not fight, period. Not only religious pacifists like the Quakers, but people who had adopted the pacifist cause as a progressive measure. You also have conscientious objectors. CO, or conscientious objector, came around in the Vietnam War as well. These are people who are not necessarily pacifists, but who are opposed. They have objections due to their conscience, particularly in this conflict. And a lot of progressives, a lot of Americans say, this is a war to help the munitions makers and the people who are going to profit off a war in Europe. It doesn't have to do with America. Woodrow Wilson, a year into the war, is desperately trying to stay out of it. What else can I do? Is there anything else I can do? He is quoted as saying, to keep us out. Another huge group, two huge groups, that were opposed to American involvement in war are the German Americans, of which we had over 2 million either direct immigrants or the children of immigrants, plus a lot of German ancestry Americans. It was one of the two biggest immigrant groups that ever came to America. They proposed, let's have an embargo, let's stop trade, but let's not go to war with Germany, because obviously these are our cousins and our relatives, and this is not a good thing. The other group is not as apparent, but also the number one immigrant group in America, Irish Americans. Again, they're direct immigrants, their children, their grandchildren. They've been coming for a long time, and they continue to come even today. So you had millions of Irish Americans. At this time, Ireland was not a separate country. It was part of Britain. So when Britain enters the war, Ireland has to join Britain. But Irish Americans in America do not. The Irish, of course, have long history of problems with Britain, and they did not support the British war effort. They did everything they could to not necessarily obstruct, but to not help the British war effort. They're assuming if Britain is weakened in the war by Germany, Ireland has a chance at independence, and this is exactly what happened. Ireland became an independent nation in the early 1920s, partly because Britain could not hold it anymore. There are cases of Allied ships being sunk off the Irish coast, and the Irish deliberately did nothing to help the sinking ships. They want nothing to do with the war. They will do nothing to help Britain. They really, really don't like the British. You have Again, something like 64,000 that claim conscientious objection. You have a lot of women involved. Women tend to be more on the pacifist side. It's their brothers, their sons, their husbands that are going to be killed. A lot of women involved in the pacifist movement. Jane Addams, particularly, there was a Women's Peace Party. The other big group are the socialists. Communists are not around yet, but the socialists, and particularly the IWW, those Wobblies, were very anti-war. Remember, their theme is Workers of the World Unite. Why should we arm our workers to go over and slaughter other workers, both of whom groups are being taken advantage of by wealthy businessmen and wealthy industrialists, who are the only ones who are going to gain from this war? They saw part of the bigger pattern. By international law, the United States and any nation had the right to ship and trade non-military goods to any nation in the world. And remember, early 1900s, America really depends on trade. We have huge manufacturing. We are manufacturing more than we can consume at home, and part of the goal is to send it overseas. This is our main source of income. If I tell you that we traded $3.2 billion worth of goods with the Allied powers, England and France, and only $27 million with Germany, it tells you which side of the war we're going to be on without even looking any further. We had a huge, huge trade surplus with England and France and very little with Germany. We don't have much to lose by cutting off Germany. We had also loaned over $2 billion to the Allies and had $500 million worth of investments in England and France. If the Allies lose, they will never repay those loans. We had very little with Germany. So how do we get into this war? The first problem is trade. So as you can see with slide number 5, you can see what Britain and Germany immediately did very early in the war. Britain blockades Germany and mines German harbors. Germany blockaded Britain and the coast of France and mined British and French harbors. So what are you going to do, America? Your economy depends on trade, and both sides are blocked. In addition, you had U-boats. U-boat was developed by the Germans originally, although they're prototypes as far back as the Civil War. U means undersea boat, literally. And if you want to see a great, great war movie, I'm not sure if it's World War I or World War II. I think it's World War II, but it has to do with submarines. The hair on the back of your neck really stands up with this one. It's an incredibly accurate war movie. It's called, in German, Das Boot, D-A-S-B-O-T. The Boat, and it deals with a submarine, a German submarine. It has English subtitles. It's an incredibly powerful war movie about what submarine warfare was really like. Germany develops U-boats in the first year of the war. She, in the beginning, is very cautious about attacking ships. She even ran ads in American newspapers that said, Americans do not travel in the Atlantic because there's a war going on. We cannot be responsible for your safety. She claimed the right to search and sink American ships that carried war goods, cargo ships. She never intended in the beginning to sink passenger ships. But these are early submarines. The technology wasn't really developed. In order to identify a ship, a submarine, they didn't even have periscopes then, let alone radar and sonar. They had to surface. Well, when you surface, everybody sees you and they can bomb you out of the water. So what they're doing in the submarines is pretty much guessing. Is this a cargo ship, a passenger ship? What kind of ship is it? They can't really tell. She begins accidentally to sink passenger ships as well. She signed in 1915 the Sussex Pledge after she sunk a ship with some Americans on board and apologized for it. The Sussex Pledge pledged Germany to not attack non-military ships. Of course, how the heck can you tell? You can't tell, really, particularly if you can't surface. January of 1917, she continues unrestricted submarine warfare. And Germany begins to attack, not deliberately passenger ships, but pretty much anything she sees out there. Her goal is to beat the Allies, beat Britain and France before America can enter the war. Because if America enters the war, Germany knows the odds are going to be against her. One of the passenger ships sunk, of course, is very famous, the Lusitania. The Germans had identified it as a warship, not as a passenger ship. So it is torpedoed, and the reason it sank in 20 minutes is that it was secretly carrying munitions, secretly carrying war materials in the hold, which the passengers did not know. So in 20 minutes, it sinks. Like the Titanic, the air pockets in the hull of the ship ran horizontally. Once they're punctured, the whole thing goes. And 1,200 passengers, almost all the passengers were killed, including 128 Americans. Now the war becomes real to Americans. And what happens is, year by year, month by month, public opinion in America, which was very much against the war, begins to change more towards pro-war. The crucial year is 1917. So the Lusitania is sunk. There are other passenger ships that are sunk with loss of American lives. And then in February, you have the Zimmerman telegram. And I have an actual photocopy of that in slides 6 and 7. The Zimmerman telegram was a diplomatic message from the German Minister of Foreign Affairs to the German ambassador in Mexico City. And what he was saying is, why don't you tell the Mexican government, that Germany will help them get back the parts of Mexico that America, quote unquote, stole from them in the Texas War of Independence and the Mexican War, which is 1840s. So Germany says, hey, come in and help us, start a little commotion on the southern border of America, and we will help you get that half of Mexico that is now American soil. This is made public in America, and there is a furious uproar about it. Those lousy, stinking Krauts, look what they're doing. Coincidentally, a lot of anti-Mexican feeling, although the Mexicans never agreed to this, never signed on to it. This wasn't an agreement. It was just a diplomatic message. But, a lot of Americans, okay, lousy, stinking Krauts and lousy, stinking Mexicans as well. So both groups are the focus of prejudice. Another key event in March, remember, month by month, we're getting closer to the war. In March of 1917, the Russian Revolution begins. In the same month, the Tsar is thrown out. Later, he and his family are executed. And by the fall of 1917, Russia withdraws from the war. She's in the midst of a civil war. She says, I can't deal with this. I'm out. So who do you have left? You have the Germans now, can throw all their weight to the Western Front against England and France, which is what they do immediately. They don't have to worry about Russia anymore. In April of 1917, finally, 5 American cargo ships are sunk within a period of 2 weeks. Germany has already said unrestricted submarine warfare, we can't move in the Atlantic, and poor Woodrow Wilson finally goes to Congress and asks for a declaration of war, which he gets almost immediately with a good handful of abstentions to the war vote. Russia is out. The Allies look like they're in serious problems. France is on the verge of collapse. In the first year of the war, we have no idea of European views of this because we did not suffer like the Europeans did. First year of the war, 1 million French soldiers are killed just in the first year, and close to 500,000 British. The French army was having problems with mutinies among the French army soldiers. They were shooting their own officers and refusing to go to the front. I am not going there to be slaughtered. We've already lost 1 million men. So France is on the verge of collapse. By 1917, the Germans are shelling the suburbs of Paris. They almost took Paris. And there's all these stories about German brutality to French citizens and to German citizens. So in April, we finally declare war, basically to bail out Britain and France, who were not doing too well. May of 17, we have a draft. December of 17, our first troops are in France. A word on the draft, because it's been a long time since we've been in a war. The Civil War was the last one. The last overseas conflict we had was the Spanish-American War. Before that, the War of 1812. We haven't had too many in American history up to this point. The draft was not called the draft. It was called selective service. They drafted young men, including African Americans. There was some controversy about this because the discussion in Congress is if we draft African Americans, they're going to demand their rights as citizens. Yes, they did. They have the right to vote, but they have been barred from voting for decades. African Americans, the war basically got the grunt work. They did a lot of the background work. They did a lot of the physical labor and were not used as much in combat. When they were used in combat, oddly enough, they fought under the French army commanders, not under the American army commanders. In France, assigned to the French army, they were treated as equals. There was no segregation in Europe. When they get back, of course, these veterans who have fought and bled and died for the American army begin to speak out. There are riots after the war, including in Houston and other Texas cities. What does Woodrow Wilson do about it? Absolutely nothing. Remember, he's a quiet racist, I would label him. Hundreds were killed in race riots during and after the war. Riots in 25 cities. Federal officials did absolutely nothing. Some of those killed actually had their U.S. Army uniforms still on. Native Americans, high percentage of volunteers. Warfare is a long tradition in Native American history. And I just recently found this out. The code talkers in World War II came from World War I. There was a group of Choctaw Indians that were drafted as a group. They went into a unit, and the American officer in France said, "Hey, you guys, you speak a strange language. Talk to each other on the radio." So well before World War II and World War I, there was a small group of what we later called code talkers, guys who were sending messages in Native American languages, which was impossible for the Germans to crack that code. Why did we take 2 years to get in? Congress and Wilson know we are not prepared. When we declared war, we had a 200,000-man army. We draft 3 million in the next 2 years. Another 2 million volunteered. The first year we sent close to 500,000 to Europe. We had to create separate units, not only for African Americans, because they are not going to be integrated. No one will work with them. No whites will work with them. But also foreign language units of draftees, particularly from New York and the East Coast. There were 42 different bilingual units just from New York City, particularly German English ones. We had a lot of people who didn't speak good English. So we had foreign language bilingual units in World War II, not in World War I, not in World War II. There's good reason for that. They got a grand total of 2 weeks training, almost no equipment. You got a helmet and a gun, basically, and were sent off to war. Women, over 1 million women, went to work in factories. They were paid equal pay with men. Think about that. The other big movement of population is African Americans who move into northern cities to take war industry jobs. Northern and Midwestern cities, the men were gone. Who's going to produce the war materials? Women and a lot of African Americans. This was called the Great Migration. And I have some slides of that in there too. I'll have to find it wherever it is. Okay, so let's talk about the war itself. This is a very simple war. You can see in the slides. I think it is slide 12, where the war was fought. You are talking about a 200-mile war. 500 miles long stretch of trenches, and they went back and forth within about 200 miles. Horrible, horrible war. One reason we never hear about this war, it was so traumatic and so terrible, nobody wanted to talk about it or discuss it after the war. And I know cases, I have older friends whose fathers fought in the war, refused to even mention it. It was so horrible. We will never fight like this again. One word, mass slaughter. This is trench warfare. We had much more lethal weapons, but we fought with the same tactics, which was basically line up and annihilate the other guy. And for 4 years, France, England, and Germany, and later on the Americans, lined up on opposite sides of a barbed wire fence and tried to slaughter as many as possible. Starting with slide number 11, you have some of the new technologies. Trench warfare means you're living in a ditch for months. Northern France and Belgium, where the whole war was fought, don't forget, it gets cold in the winter. It freezes. So these guys are living in a hole. This is where trench foot comes from. If you're living in a ditch, your feet are usually damp or wet most of the time, and your flesh begins to rot off your feet. They could never dry out. You also have problems with rats and dirt and bugs and everything else. Horrific, horrific war. Heavy artillery, much longer range, much bigger shells, constant. In fact, in 4 hours on the Western Front in France, they shot off at one point more shells, more artillery than were shot in the entire Civil War for 4 years. So shell shock, which we call PTSD today, was the cause of at least 20% of those hospitalized. Most people never recovered. 24 hours a day, you're constantly bombarded. Not only is your brain shaken loose in your brain case, but just the trauma of day after day of hearing those shells constantly, besides the slaughter when they actually do hit. Another factor that we had is came in at the end of the Civil War, really wasn't perfected by World War I. Actually, they're perfected machine guns, where you can kill a whole lot of people really fast. The other thing, of course, tanks, and you have a photo there. It doesn't look like the tanks we have today, but they were a very good weapon for covering even uneven and even ground and going through barbed wire. The other factor they had was poison gas, and that's where you have the gas masks. They even had gas masks for the dogs and horses in the war, too. Poison gas was mustard gas. These are sulfur gases, and they were heavier than air. Many people died without even knowing they were being gassed, because the gas canisters would be fired off. The gas would sink into the trenches, follow the trenches along, and kill the guys as they were sleeping. They never woke up again. The gas didn't disintegrate immediately either, and it would stay on the ground, oftentimes for weeks. Soldiers would charge across a field, not knowing that there was gas there. When they marched across the field, they would stir up the gas and die crossing a field that had been gassed 2 or 3 weeks earlier. 35% of the victims in World War I were involved with poison gas. Those who did not die had their lungs scarred for life, and there were a lot of hospitals in America and all over Europe full of patients basically dying of emphysema. They could not breathe. Their lungs were burned, and they just didn't die immediately. They could die decades later. First use of flamethrowers as well, first use of barbed wire in a war, many, many ways to die brutally in World War I. So I'm going to continue in the next slide, talk a little bit more about the slaughter, and then what I think is one of the more interesting battles in the war. I try to pick 1 or 2 in each war. Take care, stay safe.